This is Everyday Discipleship, a podcast with me, Cole Chenal, and with me is Josh Rice. We are two pastors in Northwest Arkansas at Reformation Baptist Church, and this podcast exists to equip Christians to live with a biblical worldview. And this week we're going to talk about something that is honestly something that is new for me to even be thinking about or considering, and that is education and how we educate our kids, how we think about education, whether that's public, private, homeschool, whatever option we're looking at. Like, how should Christians engage this crucial aspect of our life? And I think the big way to start it, when you and I were talking about, Josh, that, you know, the thing that keeps coming to my mind is Deuteronomy 6. Mm-hmm. It is Deuteronomy 6 about raising up our children of the Lord. And what it says is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." So I take that to mean, very intentionally so, that one of the great responsibilities of Christians is to raise up our children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. That we want our children to be raised up in the Lord, and a huge part of that is going to be their education. Mm-hmm. How we approach educating them, how we think about educating them. And so I guess let me kick it to you this way. Why is this something that now we are actually having to think about? Like, why are we talking about it on this podcast? Why is education something that Christians need to start thinking about, if they haven't already, from a biblical worldview, to figure out how to equip their children with a biblical worldview?
Well, I think the short, simple answer to that is that we live in a post-Christian society, and so I think it's interesting. You know, we've only been doing this podcast for a couple years, year and a half, and I think that we've now read this piece of scripture in Deuteronomy at least 3 times now, and so pretty interesting when we've done 50 some odd episodes that this has been in that many episodes. And I think that's because this piece of scripture is so critical. It has the command to love God, but then it talks about the importance of how do we make disciples. And we are a church, we talk so much about the Great Commission. We talk about the purpose of the church is to make disciples, saving souls, teaching them what God has commanded them to do. And I think a lot of Christians have had an idea of that in our culture, of what that means is to go out, to knock on doors, to, evangelize coworkers and that kind of stuff. And that is very true. But primarily, the way the Great Commission is accomplished, and always has been accomplished, is by mothers and fathers training their children in the ways of the Lord, and that they become Christians. And that's how the generations multiply as they go, is when parents are faithful. God in his goodness, very often, I think, as it's normative that the children of Christians become Christians themselves when they are diligently discipled. And so the short answer is, it's a world that there are a lot of competing voices and a lot of competing forces that want to educate your children.
Well, I think that's the biggest deal, right? Because it's what we talk about all the time. Christians need to live with a biblical worldview. I mean, that's the only way to honor Christ in this world. And a worldview is an all-encompassing way you see reality. Yep. It's an all-encompassing way you choose to live your life according to certain principles, values, core beliefs that influence literally everything you do. Mm-hmm. And one of the responsibilities of parents, and really in all of discipleship, even if that's just a younger believer that we're taking under our wing, one of the crucial aspects, and the way that I think maybe most parents don't think of it this way, but they really should, is that we're trying to construct our children's worldview in a way that accords with the Word of God. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's really the responsibility of discipleship.
Yeah, the world howls at us about indoctrinating our kids, but look, your kids are going to be indoctrinated.
Yeah, someone's indoctrinating them. Someone's building their worldview. The question is that worldview being built upon the foundation of God's Word, or is it being built upon secularism, humanism, enlightenment, whatever you want to say?
Yeah, and so before, I think we need to probably do this quickly, because it's not the main point. The main point of this is giving our people some practical wisdom and thought process about how to best accomplish what is commanded of us in Deuteronomy 6.
Which is building a biblical worldview for your children that they can then, by God's grace, hopefully believe in Christ and go out, beyond our home and live out that biblical worldview and be a light of the gospel so that more people can be saved.
That's right. We want to, through our diligence and through God's grace, turn around the cultural avalanche of apostasy that's happening. Because what's happening right now is that in churches, it's a very high percentage. The last time I saw it was like 75%, 80%, something like that, of 18-year-olds who, when they graduate and get out of high school and go to college, they leave the church. That's people kids that have been in there, and those are souls that are being dispersed, right? And so what's happened there is, I think, in a lot of ways, that as parents, that we have been complacent through the years in a culture that seemed to be friendly towards Christians, and we've gotten light and lackadaisical about this, about understanding that we have to diligently look. That passage shows us that Jesus, and in that sense, Yahweh had to be the focus of everything going on in the home, right? Everything you do, that's the sign and on the gate. That means when you come in, when you're in the home, when you're working, when you're talking.
At the dinner table,
that's it.
Going on trips, driving to the store, all that stuff.
That's right. It's all about Christ. It's all about living for Christ. And so kind of getting into really briefly like the meta analysis, why are we here? It's like we have this situation in America where we have compulsory education, right? Your kids have to be academically educated, and there's basically 3 avenues that can happen without basically the arm of the law coming after you. And that is that we can send them to public schools, we can have them private school educated, or we can homeschool them. And the reason we're here, and I will tell you, it causes a lot of conflict. Look, when you look around, there are very prominent voices that I love that say things like, it is extremely unwise, foolish that you send your kids off to the government and they're going to come back and be statist. And, that's a thing that we have to deal with today and talk about. We have to talk about the truth of that. The meta-analysis is that we live in a society where public education has become normative. It is the reflex action that most Americans take. They send their kids to public schools. And that happened, when you look back, there was a Christian influence, a Protestant influence that wanted to start common schools, okay, back in the 1700s, but we didn't really have compulsory education until the late 1800s.
Well, the primary reason Christians started schools is to teach people to read so they could read the Bible.
That's right. And, when you look at literacy, and that's one of the things we got to look at is like, how is the system working? We produced kids back in the 1700s that could read the Federalist Papers and could read, King James Bible and all that kind of stuff. And, I am a public school teacher today, and we have a real problem in the public school system with literacy. A lot of kids don't read very well. And I think what's happened is this, right? And this, we have to be very careful in this conversation, because education, especially academic education, is a vastly complicated issue that's not a one-size-fits-all solution. That's talking about kids themselves. That's talking about school systems.
Yeah, school districts, cities,
states. They're not the same. Like what's going on in
Parents'
Arkansas.
aptitudes.
It's so we have to be very careful. Look, people's emotions get involved here, and rightfully so. It's our children. Okay.
Well, I can probably cut off some of those emotions pretty quick.
Yeah. Okay.
Like I can cut them off at the knees. I mean, at the end of the day, basically what we're advocating for is Christian education. And now people are going to hear that like, okay, well, that mean you want me to send my kid to private school or homeschool them? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, as parents, we need to have in our mind a diligent intentionality to give our children a Christian education, which means that whatever avenue we choose, whether they go to public school, whether they go to private school, or whether we homeschool them, that we are doing our due diligence to evaluate the ideas that either we're teaching them ourselves, that they're learning in school, and that we're putting on them a Christian understanding of those things, a Christian worldview of those things. So, like when I say Christian education, sometimes in this podcast, I'm not meaning not public school. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just meaning that raising up our children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, no matter where they are. That if they're coming from public school, which is a viable option, can be a viable option, that we are asking them, what's your teacher teaching? What are you learning? What are they saying about it? How does this fit with a biblical worldview? Hey, how does God's word align with this or not align with this? And in that way, I mean, no matter what avenue you choose as your family, right? Because this is definitely a Christian conscience issue. This is not a sin, not sin type deal. Like some people want to make it that way. Some people want to make it where, if you don't homeschool your kids, you're a sinning family.
Yeah.
Or if you're not a sinning family, you're definitely not a very holy family.
Right.
That's what sometimes will happen. But that's not what we're saying at all. What we're saying is just whatever avenue you choose, which is based on Christian conscience, is you need to be making sure your children are getting a Christian education.
That's right. And a lot of the reason that we fall into this trap is that we've grown up in a society that was dominated by Christian values, especially in the South, in the Bible Belt, for a very long time. We have had Christian culture as being normative, right? So Christian morality, so to speak, is what is kind of cultural morality, or that's what's acceptable. And so for a long time, people would send their kids to public school and not even really worry about what was going on in there. Okay,
because even in the public school, it was mostly a Christian education.
That's right. Look, I'll tell you, back in the 90s, okay, I took biology. It would have been probably 1996 in high school, and my teacher taught creationism in biology class, and I think that gets to what we're talking about. Is there what happened? What has developed is there's this idea of neutrality, right? There's an idea that the public education system, just because it's academics, like math, science, English, history, that it can be neutral. The problem is that it can't be neutral, okay? And it never could be neutral. So the Christians who wanted to start common schools, they didn't want to be neutral. They wanted to teach kids how to read the Bible. You know, Horace Mann, who really was a spearhead in getting compulsory public education off the ground, he wasn't neutral either. He thought that education was the silver bullet to utopia. That's a really socialist idea, right? He thought that by the poor undesirables having equal access to education, that there wouldn't be poverty anymore. That shows a blatant misunderstanding and denial of the doctrine of sin, right? We're going to have the curse as long as we have sinful humanity around. But what that means is that the schools are not neutral, and no classroom is neutral. Yes, you can just simply teach math. You can. But we're not only teaching kids math in school. And so when you get into history and when you get into science, there is no neutrality. Now, that doesn't mean that necessarily what you are getting is indoctrination, okay? Because I can teach history and I can give nuance to the history and I can teach differing viewpoints. And at that point, I'm looking like I'm neutral, right? But what I'm trying to be is balanced, okay? And so here's the deal. Long story short on public education, if we're going to say that it's not a sin to send your kids to public education, I think we got to talk about that. To call something a sin that's not explicitly in the Bible is a very dangerous thing to do for us as Christians. We have to be very careful about making things into sin that are not sin. We don't make laws where there are no laws. Having said that, we have to say that parents cannot abdicate responsibility. Schools are not all the same. Localities have a lot to do with it.
Well, and that's like really the thing. In an ideal world too, even when everything was all rosy with the public school system, parents, we should never have been advocating our responsibility to be involved in our kids' lives and just take everything for granted. And that's like kind of what we're coming at. It's saying that you got to look at your own context. I mean, listen, where we are right here in Springdale, I grew up in the Springdale public school system. I love the Springdale public school system growing up in it. I had no problems there. You know, there was obviously some views that were anti-Christian, but it wasn't like they were pushed as anti-Christian. They were just presented alongside of Christian views too. Like I remember in science class being taught evolutionism as a theory and creationism as a theory. And they're both kind of given equal balance, and it's just what it was. I don't think I'd have a problem sending my kid to Springdale public schools. But if I'm living in Seattle, there's no chance I'm sending my kid to public school there because they are eaten up with all kind of liberal ideologies. And they're going to try to indoctrinate my kid and make him a little statist, little liberal is what's happening.
Yeah, it's basically sending your kids into a war every day.
Well, it's interesting. You know, Doug Wilson, we really like Doug Wilson. He's Presbyterian. And he has a episode of Man Rampant, which is just a talk show he does, where it's on Christian education. And I've never really thought about this way before, and I don't think you can say it's true everywhere, but it did make me think, where he kind of talks about how, you know, the anti-Christian side, however you want to call that, the liberal, leftist, whatever, the anti-Christian secular side of our country, that they don't repopulate the world at a rate that actually repopulates themselves. They are not having kids at the rate of repopulation. Whereas Christians are. We do have the 2.1 kids, typically. It's like we are repopulating ourselves. So he said was that the danger is that secular society is using Christians as breeders to just get more people that they can educate into their indoctrination.
Yeah.
And I'd never thought about that way. I'm not saying that is automatically happening, but I think that's how we have to look at things right now. That like you said, someone's going to be building your kid's worldview. Someone is. And if you think that just them being in the home and not being intentional about it is going to be enough, don't we have the last 20 or 30 years to prove that that's not the case? I mean, I'm in the least church generation of our country's ever seen. There's less people going to church now that of my generation than ever have.
That has come from somewhere.
That had to there's got to be some answer to that, right? I don't think it's all laid at the foot of public schools. I think some of it is pragmatic churches.
Yeah, it's media. It's a lot of things. But definitely kids who are being in a place for 7.5 hours a day. It's doing something, right? It's shaping minds.
And even as a parent, if I'm going to send my kid off, I think you just got to be intentional. Again, that's what we're arguing for and advocating for. Is because thinking about sending Owen. If I send Owen to a public school from year 5 to 18, that's 13 years, 7 hours a day, 5 days a week for a majority of the year. Who am I able to spend that much time with my son?
No.
I mean, I just don't think that's possible. And again, not saying that it's not possible to still give him a Christian worldview. I mean, that's where the child comes into play. I'm sure we'll talk about that some. But but we have to you have to at least start thinking about these things and start thinking like, okay, how is my kid's worldview being shaped? Are they building a Christian worldview, or is something else happening in my home and I'm not even aware of it?
Yeah, and that's where that's where at the end of the day, what we're going to say is that you're going to have to watch what's going on. You're going to have to watch it very carefully. There's you brought up Douglas Wilson. He's big on Christian education and that sort of thing. And there's another guy who's well within our fold who I love. He is actually probably my favorite pastor, is Voddie Baucham. And Voddie Baucham is quoted as saying that if you give your kids to Caesar, don't be surprised when they come back as Romans. And that's very true. And I would say, along with what Voddie Baucham says, that is very true in a national sense. We are a post-Christian nation, and so what we're going to see is an increasingly untenable ability to send your kids to public school. We're going to see it become increasingly unwise to do so, because that is where our culture is going right now.
Well, like for instance, like in California, in I know California, Seattle, because I used to live there. Like there are laws that advocate and encourage teachers to teach children safe sex education, masturbation, sexual perversion as young as 2nd grade.
Yeah.
If people think that's insane, whoever would do that,
are doing that.
You
think that's insane because we're in Arkansas.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that's in Arkansas by any means,
right?
But that's what we're talking about when we start talking about it's going to become increasingly more untenable to send your child to public school. There is probably a line in there where it is just absolute foolishness to send your kids to public school.
Yeah, I think so.
I don't think everywhere in the country has hit that.
No.
I don't think really we've hit that here.
Look, I'm in the middle of that, and I like I said, I've been a public school teacher for 16 years now, and so I've seen a lot of change. There's been rapid change in the last 16 years. So I got to bridge when I was a student in the 80s and 90s until I've been a teacher from the early 2000s all the way to now. And what I've seen is that look, the national government actually has very little influence in what happens inside the school. Okay, very little at all. All they do is they've got funding that gets tied to basically lunches and stuff.
Yeah.
Okay,
you get this federal funding, but also if you're going to take this federal funding, you got to start teaching this kind of curriculum.
It's really not even that so much. It really is more tied to like technology and student lunches. Where oversight starts to come in is at the state level, and the state is basically who approves curriculum for public schools. So Arkansas has their own stuff. So here's the thing, and this was being my response to Voddie. It's like, yes, that's absolutely true in a wide
general sense,
in a Band-Aid sense, in a whole coverage sense. But what's really true is that what's happened in Arkansas is that as we've sent our little ones to quote Caesar at Arkansas, what we've produced is more and more conservatives in Arkansas. Well, Arkansas has gotten, and I'm talking politically here, but look, when you're looking, this is where it gets mishmashed, right? It's like politics are very tied to. Well,
that's what secularism does. Like,
yes.
Listen, we live in a secular country. What secularism does is it ties politics to literally everything.
That's exactly
That's why, like, it's in your sports, it's in your movies, it's in your music, it's in your books. It's everywhere, and there's not really any escaping it. The question is, are we going to view politics from a biblical worldview or a secular worldview? That's what we're talking about, is we need to have a biblical worldview in every single avenue of life and every single thing we're engaging in.
Yeah, and so you have teachers, because once the state decides this is the curriculum, then school boards are the school board is who really determines what is my school district going to do, okay? And then even the lower level that I think sometimes it's one of the weird things about government. It's sometimes we make them like the all-powerful boogeyman at times, like, oh, the government.
But they also got that bureaucratic red tape that makes them woefully inefficient.
You have to understand that they're not nearly as quick and efficient as they're given credit sometimes, because even when the state does crazy stuff, it takes years for that to trickle down into the classroom, because you have people like me, and I mean like me in the sense of I'm a veteran teacher, old dog, new tricks, that kind of stuff, where a lot of teachers who may not even be like fighting the battle for like, hey, I'm not letting this through, they're like, you know what, I'm not doing that because I've never done that, and I'm not going to start now. And so at the end of the day, is the school board actually going to walk into that teacher's classroom? No. It takes people complaining about it. So what's going on is the teacher is so powerful in the public education system.
Well, if you listen to like past episodes, I mean, they almost hold a position of lesser magistrate.
That's right. They interpose. And so I would throw this bit of wisdom. That's not what this is about, but it's a bit of wisdom. We have several public school teachers in our church. Okay, I'm being one of them. And I would tell you that the wisdom is this. Look, I don't think the government should be involved in education. I think it's outside of their purview. But, it's been redeemed in a lot of ways because man wanted to be a socialist utopia. But what happened is a lot of localities got involved and started teaching the gospel in public school. And that happened for a long time. And what you got to understand is, as a teacher in this system, you're not sinful by being a teacher.
Heck no.
Your time was not wasted. Your time is to be a light in a place that can be dark. But I will say this, and I've thought about this a lot myself. You have to decide what that line is for you. What is the line that I'm not going to cross, where it's gonna make my conscience start burning? And this is the point where I'm willing to lose my job over this line right here. Well, and I think we have to decide that.
That's what's so funny is like that's like in every job right now.
Absolutely.
Around like every company that's going woke or whatever, like there's LGBTQ affirming or Black Lives Matter affirming or whatever. Yep. Like there's certain things that Christians are just gonna have to say at a certain point. I'm not gonna be able to do that.
That's right.
And so I'm either gonna have to be okay with never getting promoted again, never getting a raise again, being flat out fired, which is probably the least likely option because they know they'll get sued.
Getting harassed.
But getting harassed and just making your life miserable there until you quit.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really what Christians
that's what usually happens. Yeah, that's what usually happens. So I would say that. Like, I want to encourage our teachers to say, look, like...
Well, you're doing a good work, too.
You have a really important thing going on.
Because, let's face it, most parents do not parent or love their children well. And sometimes the only love those kids are going to get is from a teacher in school.
That's
and
true.
if that teacher is a Christian that loves them, encourages them, what kind of inroads or avenues for the gospel could that actually make?
Huge.
I mean,
huge inroads.
That's why I would never ever. Well, I can't say never ever because who knows what
there
they
does
come
get
up
a
with.
point. There does get a.
But I would not be saying right now it is sinful to be involved in public school or send your kid to public school. That's just not the case.
Right.
That's just not true. The gospel is. We still believe the gospel is powerful enough that light goes into darkness and. The light is not overcome by the darkness.
Yeah. So having said all that, we do, I think, have to talk about the wisdom of deciding what to do. We have a ton of parents at our church who have 3 and 4 year olds, and this decision is right around the door.
I'm one of them. I'm already thinking about trying to figure this out.
And it is hard.
I'll tell you the thing that's like kind of put in my mind. I'm really kind of considering it from 2 different avenues.
Okay.
One is, like obviously the homeschool is kind of like the easy option, not in terms of the work, but the easy option in terms of the most control.
The safety.
The most. I have the most control. I'm able to figure out everything. But there's things about it I don't like, right? And there's ways around these things. But I liked playing sports growing up. Sports were integral to my life. Like they made me who I am today. They taught me discipline, teamwork, working together, aspects like that, and also the social aspect. That's what most parents get worried about is the social aspect of raising kids in a homeschool environment. But when I think about like whether it's private school or public school, I think you have obviously to differing degrees, but I think you have the same problems in both and the same things you have to consider in both.
Yes.
On the one hand, you got to consider what's actually being taught. What's the kind of curriculum being taught? Like, is LGBTQ affirming stuff being pushed on my kid where transgenderism is becoming normative and being encouraged to be normative, and if you don't believe it's normative, then you're actually evil, wicked, and a bigot. I mean, that is going on in certain schools in our country. And so you got to think about education-wise, is antithetical to Christian teaching stuff being pushed down my kid's throat. But then there's another part that no one really can control whatsoever, not even the teachers, which is like, this whole little pagan culture all these little kids develop of themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you're a teacher there all the time. Like, teachers have some control when it comes to the classroom, but inside of schools, there's this little subculture of these little mini pagans that are running around that build their own power structure. They build their own cultural norms, cultural values. And if that is in a community of godlessness and where parents are not parenting their children or raising them up in holiness, what you're going to get is a bunch of sexual perversion, a bunch of lewd lawlessness, of drunkenness, parties, rebellion, all this kind of stuff. I mean, like, you know, think about, like, in most schools you're going to have like a group of the good kids and a group of the bad kids, but you understand what I'm saying. Like, your kid's going to be exposed to stuff. Like me, I had great Christian friends growing up, but I was exposed to stuff that really kind of sent my faith on the rails a little bit, because I would give in to what the world wanted, because I wanted to see what that was like, and I only ever learned about that from other kids in the school.
Yeah, and I would say flat out that there is a lot of wisdom in parenting to try to, as much as we can, look, we're not God, right? And we can't control everything, but as much as we can, to have kind of a progression of sanctification and progression of the size of the battle that the kid is going to face. Like a kid being exposed to, you know, nude pictures on their phone, vile social media stuff, and just relentless peer pressure when they're 13 years old, like, is really tough.
Your daughter being told, if you want to be a popular girl, you got to send out naked pictures.
Yes.
Like, that happens.
Yeah, and that's a battle. And look, you know, just from a wisdom standpoint, your daughter is much more likely to be able to stand up to that temptation and to stand firm when she's 22 than she is when she's 14.
Well, and I thought about that this morning when we were talking about it. It's because, like, when you're an adult, your worldview is formed and shaped. Like, that's why people kind of get set in their ways, and people don't typically change after a certain point. Like, there's not a lot that people are going to be able to say to me that's going to make me change my opinions and worldviews on in a major shift kind of way.
Yeah.
But a kid that's still developing it, how you develop a worldview is you adopt things, try them out, see what works, see what doesn't work. Like, you're obviously going to reject things prima facie, like on the face of them, if they're absurd. But things that sound reasonable, you're gonna try to incorporate those, see if they work themselves out. Like, sounds reasonable. Well, shouldn't we love and accept other people? Of course. But does that mean we affirm homosexuality and transgender? No. But a child doesn't have that ability to firm that up. And so that's where the worldview shift starts happening, and where you get kids that leave the church, abandon the faith, and deny Christ after it's all said and done with.
Look, and here's the other thing. Like, look, I think the dangers and the pitfalls of public education are widely known, right, within our circle. You know, you got pagan culture, you got possible indoctrination coming from the top down in school districts. You've got, you know, lots of just crazy subculture stuff going on, but. And I will say that, and I would say this also, that to maybe a lesser extent on the top-down perversion, you have the same thing going in private Christian school if you're not really careful.
Yeah, and sometimes even worse, because like those private Christian kids, like, their parents think that everything's fine, so they check off on them less, and they have an even more perverse little subculture going on. But the thing is there too is, like, saying those are the problems that you have to think about, like, as a parent, like, because you ultimately you're the one that has to assess the risk. You're the one that has to assess, what can I handle, what can I not handle, what am I willing to accept, what am I willing to risk, what am I not willing to risk. There's answers to all those things. I mean, there are. Like, at the end of the day, you really can control your kid's friend group by and large of who to hang out with outside of school. You can check up on what your teacher's teaching your child.
Yes, you can.
You can figure out what books they're being sent home to read. You can figure out what their syllabi are saying, or what their agendas are saying, and figuring out, hey, what's going on here, and asking questions when you really want to know. I mean, there's ways to combat those things. The way I look at public school right now, because, like, listen, public school's still on the table for me and my family. Everything's on the table. All three of those options are on the table. Public school for me, here's how I look at it. It's probably going to be just as much work as homeschooling. Honestly, at the end of the day,
it's different kind of work.
Different kind of work, because what I'm good in homeschooling, we're going to be doing all that work, starting from scratch, all that stuff. If I send Owen to public school, I'm going to be spending, depending on where I'm at, every day or every week in deconstructing whatever he's learned, basically. like really getting in there and figuring out, okay, what are you learning? What are they teaching you? Hey, that's great. This is good. This is true. Hey, this is not true. This is how the gospel answers it. This is how the Bible says it. Here's how you answer that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just, you're going to be doing a lot of work one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the fact of the matter. We're at a point in our culture where I don't care what option you choose, public, private, homeschooling, you better be ready to work as a parent.
Yeah, and that's true, because here's the thing, like, you don't often hear many of the defenses of public school from people in our camp. Okay, so let me give you a couple of the defenses of public school. You mentioned program, and look, that's a dirty word for us at church. We run a simple church model with not a lot of programs, but the fact of the matter is that sports programs and like music and extracurricular,
Mm-hmm.
they're very robust in the public system. But here's the other part of it, is that especially when you get into junior high and high school age children, the academics become very rigorous.
Yeah,
Okay?
there's benchmark education standards.
That's right. And you know, you have to teach trigonometry, pre-calculus, literature, and sometimes for a parent that can really be a stretch.
Yeah.
Right? It can really be a stretch. And in the public school system, let's assume everything. Let's assume you're listening to us. Let's assume that you're taking wisdom, that you are very eager to disciple your children. Okay? And I assume that you are. Then what you have to understand is that you can watch and evaluate in the public school system, and you can handpick teachers, and you can streamline that kid, and you can kind of coordinate that kid's path through public education. And in public education, there are veteran, very skillful teachers that are in some of these schools. And look, I don't want to give myself airs, but I'm one of those. Look, like I can teach your child to weld and to fabricate metal and to, you know, learn plant biology and botany and economics. Those are areas that are specialty for me, and I've been doing that for 16 years. I can probably do that at a much higher level than you can as a parent who's not trained in those fields. So look, there is some benefit and cost, right? Like, you do have access, especially when you're plugged in, you have some access to some professionals who are very talented and skilled in their field.
And listen, just where we live in Northwest Arkansas, many of them are going to be Christians.
Yes.
Many of them are going to be Christians that love the Lord.
Yep.
They might not be Reformed Calvinists like we are, but they're Christians that love the Lord.
There are a lot of teachers that are not hostile to a Christian worldview, but in fact are favorable to the Christian worldview.
And that's like where I think wisdom just kind of comes in, where you gotta think as a parent. I think the Lord's going to lead you. I think that we have to trust the inner leading of the Holy Spirit and His conviction that He will kind of show us what is best for our children. Because, listen, God cares for our kids' holiness more than we care for it even.
That's
yes,
right.
we want them to be saved, but no one wants His people to be saved more than God.
That's right. That's right. So when you're thinking about it as a homeschool parent, if you're considering homeschool, the big challenges that you have to think through, right? You have to think through, I'm going to have to
pacing.
I'm going to pace. I'm going to have good curriculum that I found and be academically rigorous.
Which, like, listen, there's positive there too, because with the one-on-one education, you can get a lot of education done in a lot shorter time.
It's much more efficient.
You could do it like 2 or 3 hours a day.
Yep.
And that's not your kids getting just as much or more education they would be in public school.
That's exactly right. Yep.
And you have more time to spend with as a family doing family stuff, right? Like there's definitely positives to homeschooling too.
True.
And there's some negatives, like the being more intentional about social interactions and stuff like that.
You're going to have to do that. That's the work of it. Is you're going to have to make those connections so that you can have the social interaction. You're going to have to make extra work. Really be diligent about getting them involved in opportunities to build their talents and skills, like especially in the areas of music or in
be able to interact with other
sports.
people. I mean, that's one of the big things too. Like you have to, your child needs to learn how to interact with peers in the world and understand how you listen. Because I've thought about this. This might offend some people. But let's just face it. We all know it. Sometimes homeschool kids can be a little different.
Yeah.
They can be a little bit awkward, not really know how to interact with people. And I think one of the reasons for that is because we teach our children only the culture of the home. That there's culture everywhere you go, right? There's church culture, home culture, public culture. And so in our homes, we have weird family cultures. I mean, like me and Jess, we do weird things that we would never let people see outside of our 4 walls of our house.
You gonna throw that teaser out there?
I'm not. I honestly don't even know one I could say. It's just like weird ways you talk to each other, like weird inside jokes you have.
Yeah. So Abby and I call each other dinkers.
Yeah,
because
so
she spelled a word she said that. So that's a weird thing we do that nobody would understand.
I mean, like it's a terrible play, like on podcasts, but like when we are like doing something kind of sneaky or mischievous in terms of food or dessert or like being a little bit overindulgent on something, like it's like being a mouse, like, and putting your hands to your face and going, you know, like that's like the joke. But that's stinking weirdo stuff.
Yeah, if you do that at the lunch table.
Oh my gosh,
yeah.
everyone, even me. I mean, what the heck is that person doing? And so, like, I think that some of the aspect of it is that if you're homeschooling your kids, you got to kind of teach them, hey, this is how we act in a home, and that's totally great and acceptable because we're our own little culture. But there's also a level of just being in the world and being able to engage with other people, being professional, being able to look people in the eye, shake their hand, say hello, and not being intimidated and not being scared just because you haven't had much interaction with people outside of your house.
Right. It takes intentionality to do that, for sure. And that, you know, I think if you're looking at the other side, though, those are kind of the challenges. Those are the ways to think through. You got, you know, there's a lot of resources out there, but you want to think through that curriculum. You want to think through how you're going to get connected with other people. You want to think through how you're going to give them opportunities in those extracurricular areas. If you're doing the private or public school thing, I think the challenge that you really got to think about is you got to look at what's going on that school board. That is so crucial, and that's what most parents don't know. Who are these school board members? And these, you know, it's like when we talked about the government. These are local magistrates. They're lesser magistrates. You can call them on the phone and ask them. You can email them, and they'll respond to you. They're regular people who are in business, and you know, they're in the community, and so you can ask them, like, hey, what's your school doing with critical race theory? Like, what are your thoughts on that? That kind of thing. You can ask them that. But then even more drilled down than that, you want to look at the school culture. Like, what is this principal doing? And they'll talk to you also. And then so finely tuned, you need to know what's going on in that classroom with a teacher. And look, I'll tell you, I'm sending my 8-year-old right now. She's been in public school in Springdale for 3 years. We have, at this point, look, we're intense. I told Cole earlier on the phone that it's like I liken it to the red eye of Sauron looking at him, you know, because I love my baby. Like she's precious to me, and I want to disciple her, and I don't want to neglect my duty and abdicate. And what's happened is we've just not seen anything concerning. She's reading at an extremely high level. She's really excellent at math. Her mom's done a lot of that too, but she gets reinforced at school. There's not been any attempts to bend history. We look at the stuff, you know, because she's had 3 teachers who have been...
Well, because that's where people might not understand. Where it's going to happen, like where the indoctrination, anti-Christian stuff is going to happen in the school is mostly going to be in history and science courses.
Yes. Yeah, because you get the Darwinism and the evolution in the science, and you get really like kind of just that nasty, all the anti-creation, anti-God, naturalistic viewpoint. And then in history, that's where you get all this
history.
We're oppressors. We've hated the LGBT.
Colonizers, Christians are an oppressive people.
Or just flat out lying about history or omitting parts. You know, I was actually asking kids today, like, have you heard of George Washington Carver or Booker T. Washington and things like that? And they didn't. And you know, I'm speaking out both sides of my mouth. That's kind of a strike against history in my high school, is that like those are, if you're going to talk about like history, those are really important figures in American history, you know. And there's all this talk about equal representation. Those are men whose words need to be acknowledged. They were very influential people, and so that's kind of where you're steering. You're looking, what's going on in that classroom? How can I, and the decision that every parent has to make. And I think there's this sliding scale. There's a scale of how bad is this school district, right? Like, what do I think I'm sending them into? But then there's also like, what kind of kid do I have and what is their age level, right? So a 6-year-old, if they're going to come in, and I'm pretty sure that they're going to start pounding, you know, LGBT inclusion, evolution, Darwinism, if they're going to start hitting them at 6 or 7 years old, then it becomes probably a pretty untenable situation for me to think about putting them in that school.
Well, that's like the thing, because a lot of people will say, no, your kids should be in public school because they need to be a light. They need to be a light. They need to be a light. And it's like, maybe.
I like that argument for Christian teachers.
Yeah.
I don't like that argument for students.
Yeah, kids are not meant to be a light. The family is meant to be a light. The kid is just meant to be discipled and figure out how to follow Christ. You know, and I think that there are definitely kids that are mature enough and stable enough to be able to go in there and be a light. But that doesn't mean that like a parent that doesn't send their kid into public school or private school that they're aren't being a light.
The mission field.
Yeah, that's not what and some people will say that.
Yeah.
And that's just not true. That I personally don't think that my child is worth a sacrificial altar of quote unquote mission, because if they get 12 or 13 years of their life is spent in school, the rest of the 60, 70 is going to be spent outside of it.
Yeah.
I'd rather have them be a light in the 60 and 70 than the 12.
Well, and look, going back to the beginning of this episode, is the gospel primarily spreads through Owen being a good father someday that's thinking through this stuff and is discipling his children.
Yeah.
Right? That's how the primary way, the normative way that the gospel progresses. It's through the work of the church and through the work of parents. And so when you're thinking through that, you look, it's not sending them into the mission field. It's deciding how dangerous is this? What are the advantages? Why am I saying, look, the reason Abby is in public school right now is because she loves it. She's doing really well academically. I think she's in a situation that's not hostile. I'm under no misconceptions about neutrality and anything like that. And I don't think, look, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, so I'm not going to say where she goes, but she goes to this elementary school, and this elementary school is not neutral because the principal is a Christian, and her 3 teachers have been Christians. And look, like, they're telling, they told Abby when I had to go to the hospital, last year, that they were praying for our family, that they were praying for me, that, they asked her about her church. She's just in a situation where she's really like kind of getting an extension of Christian education in public school. And that's a really great situation. And she loves it there.
Yeah, I think because that's the hard part of the private school. Because I think if you're going to have the best of both worlds, it's really just a really established private Christian school.
A really well-run one, yeah.
But the problem with that is the money. I mean,
yeah, very expensive.
And especially for like kind of people in our camp where most women are going to be trying to be at home,
yep.
and you're going to be trying to live off one income. It just becomes a little bit impractical and untenable to be able to afford like a $12,000 a year.
Well, and that's the injustice
tuition.
of the government solution, right? You're paying for the public school whether you go or not.
Yeah, that's where school choice became such an important deal,
Yeah.
and it just kind of gets ignored because nobody cares.
Yeah, talk about like this issue is gnarly, right? Like there's all kinds of avenues to it. But yeah.
But that's what. But really, at the end of the day, I mean, because like I don't know how much more you had to.
No.
Say.
I think we've probably done a good job there.
I mean, really, here, if we're going to boil it down, here's where I kind of come at it. I don't care what you do. I don't care if you send your kid to public school. I don't care if you send them to private school. I don't care if you homeschool them. I really don't, because like I said, like that's a definite Christian conscience issue. That is not a sin issue. And anybody that makes it one is adding law where there is no law, and they're a Pharisee and a legalist. And that's just sinful in their own right.
Yeah.
It's not about what you do. All we're trying to get people to do is, first of all, at least think about it.
Yeah.
At least ask the questions of what are we going to do and why are we going to do it? Because if you can give me a good answer, I'm happy with it.
Yeah.
But then the second part is kind of gearing up to be intentional no matter what avenue you choose.
Yeah.
And understanding that education is not just about academics and learning to read and learning to do math. Education is about building worldviews that are going to solidify who that child is in their adult life.
Yeah.
And as Christian parents, our job is to give our children a Christian worldview.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, I think that's probably a good place to end. I only had one more thing, and it's real quick, and that is this. I want to give parents encouragement, too, that just because you start down one path does not mean you have to continue down that path either, right? If your kid's in second grade and you get new school board members, or you get a really rogue principal or something, and it's not looking good, take them out of there.
Yeah.
Take them out of there. There is no like
vice versa. Like I know parents that have
right.
had their kids in homeschool and they put them in there in junior high.
That's right. Like that, that you are the one that it's your responsibility. It's not the state's, and it's not the church's responsibility. It is you as a parent. That's your privilege and your responsibility before God to disciple them. And so I hope that is really helpful. It's a really it's a thorny thing, and it's really tough, and it's that gray area stuff.
Yeah, it's gray area because it's not dictating what people should do. It's just telling people you need to think.
Yeah.
You need to consider this. You need to pray about this. You and your family need to start praying about this. Especially, if you got kids already in the system, that's fine. Like, let them be in there. Just be intentional about it. Start today. Start tomorrow. And if we got kids that are 4, 3, 2 years old, you need to start praying about it and thinking of it, and also start having your ear to the ground on some of this stuff, like asking teachers, like if you're in church, hey, what does get taught at your school? Because even I have teachers that have told me in our church that, hey, they're starting to push some of the CRT LGBTQ stuff in some districts, but like you're here and like, hey, we're not doing that here. So I think you just ask teachers in your school district, hey, what actually is happening?
Yeah, for sure. And and also pray for people in the education system. We want to take this thing back. We want to have kids that turn this culture around, and that's how we're going to do it as Christians. That's how we have to be faithful, and that's what that's the guiding theme of our church and of this podcast ministry, is to try to be faithful and to teach Christians how to live their lives faithfully. So I think that's it for the day. So I hope that this was really helpful. Join us again next time on Everyday Discipleship.